Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Michael McEvoy. I am the Information and Privacy Commissioner from British Columbia, and I want to begin, first of all, by thanking Stuart and Carole and the entire organization of PL&B for once again having me. It is just an incredible conference with hospitality, and for those of us lucky enough to get to travel a bit around the world doing these kinds of events, this one offers something I think that's extremely unique, which is both a global perspective, but also a very intimate one in this incredible college setting. So thank you, Stuart, and your team for this. So how does the Information and Privacy Commissioner from British Columbia end up moderating a panel on Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, you may be asking, and it's a very good one. So I was the Deputy Commissioner in British Columbia under a woman you may know, Liz Denham, who was our Commissioner, and then she moved to the UK. And Liz gave me a call in, I think, the spring of 2017, and she said, you need to read this article in the Guardian newspaper Observer. We had fallen on the heels of the Brexit referendum. There were many questions about what had happened. How did this all transpire? Who was communicating with whom? How are political parties and the parties to the referendum communicating? She said, I think I want to do something on how political parties and organizations in the UK collect and use information about their citizens and voters. Would you be interested in coming over and working with it's an incredible team that I have here, who's Steve Wood was one of those. Steve is in the audience this morning. And after some reflection, I said yes. And so that's the way things started. Steve and I were talking about this morning. I was political science, student of political science, got a chance to interview the technical people, Lib Dems, with the Labour and Conservative parties. And then I finally got to meet this woman, Carole Cadwalladr, an award-winning journalist who's with us this morning. I was teasing her a few months ago that it was going to be very painful for a woman from Oxford to be sitting here in Cambridge in a seat next to us. And in fact, Carole, that appears to you have avoided the pain of that. And I think talking to us, unfortunately, she did want to be here. But to Carole, I think you're in Madrid this morning. Is that right?
Hello, yes, I'm so sorry. I got stranded abroad, so I'm really sorry that I can't be there, but I'm here in spirit.
Yes, well, thank you for that. And after some of the discussions I had with Carole working at the ICO as regulator, she said the person you really want to talk to understand, try and understand what's happening in the behind the curtain in the way political parties are organizing and targeting voters and so on. There's a fellow by the name of Chris Wylie, who's with us here this morning. Chris, of course, became known as the whistleblower in the Facebook Cambridge Analytica matter. He is now with H&M in the UK, doing work there, but has continued to talk on these topics and to educate people about the role of organizations and how they collect and use and target people, and we'll get to that in a few moments. And of course, that moment in time where this appeared both in the Observer and the New York Times and was, I think, it really was a seminal event and had seismic implications for the way the public and many people look at the issue of privacy and how data is collected and used. I should note, Stuart and I were talking about this last evening, a very generous invitation was offered to I was going to say Facebook, but I guess now called Meta, to be part of this panel. They politely declined the offer. Perhaps a matter I was going to say they may want to forget, but of course the tales of this story are with us to this very day. The ramifications for legislation, for regulation, for litigation, all of which, in fact, just last week, my colleague in Australia was in court with the judge telling Angeline Falk and Facebook to get together in a mediation session with respect to Facebook Cambridge Analytica data. So this is, 5 years on, still happening. Nana Botchorichvili, who is here from France, she was previously with the CNIL, now with Ideas Avocats. She's an avocat in France. We'll do a bit of an overview of where we are with the world of regulation and legislation, things that unfolded, and perhaps a little bit of the litigation that is ongoing. And as the epilogue to this, Stephen Bonner, who you already had a chance to meet from the ICO, will do, as I describe, a bit of an epilogue to assuage my guilt, which I'll explain in due course. But Carole, I want to begin this conversation with you. I'll just say, put up a few headlines here. And we now talk about, oh, Carole, a world of disinformation. It's all kind of, it's all very secondhand to us now. But following on the Brexit referendum, or the European referendum here in the UK, you began to look at an issue that in many ways was new territory, disinformation, targeting of voters. You were kind of entering this in a way, a very dark room. Can you maybe tell us a bit what that was like, how you found your way around and trying to explain this to the public and readers about what was happening?
I think that's right. We are in a completely different landscape now with a completely different understanding of this. And it felt, I think it felt like we were sort of clawing our way in darkness, trying to sort of uncover some of these issues. And I think that the sort of key realization for me, which was the fact that the referendum took place just completely in darkness. So, there was a lot of sort of evidence online. Dominic Cummings, who was the strategist, became quite infamous later on, but he was the chief strategist for the Vote Leave campaign. He wrote thousands and thousands of words in which he wrote about his brilliance in leading the campaign online with millions of ads being targeted at people. And he kind of boasts about how the mainstream media had no idea of what was going on because they didn't see any of this. And that is the sort of key point about it, which was that, we've had these laws for more than 100 years, which regulate how we run elections. And we regulate so that we have this level playing field. That's the fundamental concept, which is that one side can't massively outspend the other side. We have laws which regulate that spending. But we had, and there are laws which you have to put an imprint on every political ad. And every political leaflet gets stored in the British Library. And yet in this, referendum, which pivotal in terms of British history, in terms of, our constitution, it all happened entirely in darkness. And the Cummings is very open about the fact this is where they put all of their money into online targeting. And he writes about how they were so clever in their use of data. They were using these physicists. They were doing really clever things with data to target people in novel ways. And yet we had access to absolutely none of that. And I think it was that realization that this, fundamental, central aspect of our society, how we elect our governments, how we make our legislation, was being conducted on a private platform to which we had no access, was run by a massive multinational company, which was not within the jurisdiction of our country. It was, completely offshore. It was outside our national legislation. And we there was no way of getting access to finding out what happened. And I think, the point is that 5 years on, as you say, there's such a long tail to this story. But yet we still don't have even fundamental answers to many of these questions. And, and of course, there's a huge irony to that. And this was the referendum about taking back control of British sovereignty. And yet the actual mechanism for that was conducted on a platform for which was absolutely outside British sovereignty, and as I say, to which the fundamental evidence of what happened we still don't have access to.
Yes. Thanks for that, Carole. And Chris, you were one of the people that helped Carole kind of navigate that world. And ironically, Cambridge Analytica did actually have a Cambridge connection that we're here. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and kind of what you see, what you've seen as the takeaways from this whole matter.
Sure. Can people hear me? Is this, yeah. So, I mean, just to touch on what Carole was saying on the vote leave side, when you look at one of the largest infractions of campaign finance law in British history, and there was no substantive call to really investigate that beyond just, a slap on the wrist. And for me, the thing that I think is so disappointing about what happened there is that if you get caught, doping in the Olympics, if you get caught cheating on an exam, you get disqualified. And when you have such a profound, change, irrevocable change to the constitutional settlement of a country, where there are clouds of illegality and also a lot, as Carole said, still a lot of unknown questions about actually what went on Facebook. And yet the referendum still stood. And for me, that was, I think, what was the most disappointing thing, regardless of whether you were in favor of remain or leave. If there are substantial questions about the conduct and the legality of that conduct on something that you can't revoke, an irrevocable change, that surely there should have been a more robust investigation into that, or an inquiry, which hasn't happened. I think on the broader issue of the role of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and the whole scandal that happened there, I'm disappointed at the pace of regulatory change, which I know we've talked about a lot. I think its main impact was, creating a much wider awareness in the public about what actually happens with your data. That when Carole and I started working together on the story, data protection was not a front page issue, right? The words disinformation, misinformation, these were words that I often had to explain to journalists what they meant. Now we talk about it every day. You see it in the news every day. And so I think its primary impact was to mainstream an issue which needed mainstreaming and opening up awareness in the public and with journalists to what's actually happening under the hood of these platforms that you use every day. But I am sort of disappointed that, beyond public awareness, we haven't seen, monumental or any substantive pivoting in regulation, particularly around AI.
Yes, and that adds another layer to this. As a regulator who deals with legislators all the time, I have to say I suffer from impatience in terms of trying to move the agenda. But things have been happening. There have been things that have been going on globally, I think, and maybe Nana, you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I must say that I'm a little bit of an outsider on this panel because I haven't lived the events from the inside, but it's true that I was with the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, when this happened, so I also have a feeling of how we lived it from the regulator's perspective at the time. So I would rather bring an external perspective on this to talk about the regulatory response to the scandal. And I would say that to start with, I agree with what you just said, Chris, but personally, I have the feeling that still this scandal triggered increased scrutiny for the activities of online platforms and the whole political advertising industry, which was rather under the radar before. So I think this is a first change. And so we have seen quite substantial regulatory response at different levels and in a progressive manner. I would say it didn't happen all at once in 2017 nor in the years coming after, but we are still seeing something that is evolving. And I think that first this has come from the data protection authorities who took immediate action and in particular enforcement action. And I'm, of course, primarily thinking of the ICO's investigations that Michael just mentioned, and which led notably to enforcement notices addressed to some of the actors of the whole scandal, and in particular, of course, to Facebook, with a penalty of £500,000, which at the time was the maximum penalty. It must be underlined, I think, for unfair processing of data, for failure to protect the data of the users from misuse and undue sharing. And I'm also thinking in terms of enforcement of the settlement of the order from the FTC in 2019 with a $5 billion penalty, imposing quite heavy requirements on Facebook in terms of privacy changes, but also to the structure also of the company and its decision-making practices regarding privacy. And from what I understand, recently the FTC has issued a statement where it is possibly considering reopening this settlement order, because it considers that some of the requirements that it had imposed at the time might not be complied with by Facebook, notably, for instance, regarding the sharing of data with third parties. But beyond these two major, I would say, responses, there also have been sanctions in Brazil, in Italy, by competent authorities. Michael just mentioned that there is ongoing litigation in Canada. There are also several lawsuits at state level in the US. So, well, this shows that indeed there has been a response from authorities to sanction the practices. I would just briefly mention one different outcome maybe in Canada, where in fact the Canadian courts dismissed the case which was brought by the OIPC so far, but maybe there may be a follow-up to this case.
There is an appeal that has been launched by the Privacy Commissioner for Canada of that decision.
In addition to enforcement, what I have noted is the response through guidance from data protection authorities. So we might say that guidance is soft law, it's not mandatory, but I think that still it was an important exercise, because data protection authorities clarified what is relevant when we were talking about political advertising practices, how this whole industry, but also online platforms, how to comply with the specific data protection requirements to address the risks that we have seen in terms of profiling, transparency, unfair data processing. There has been guidance from the ICO. National data protection authorities in the EU updated their guidance, notably, for instance, the CNIL updated its guidance on how to use data in the context of political campaigning, when data is also used from social media. But I'm mostly thinking about what has been done at the European level with the Article 29 Working Party and then the European Data Protection Board, where we have even seen the creation of a dedicated subgroup to activities of social media to work really on how data protection requirements are to be applied by these actors. And the first outcome of this work was the adoption of guidelines on the targeting of social media users, which contains dedicated developments on also how this applies to political advertising and the roles and responsibilities of the different actors, and what is permissible, under which conditions, and how this can be done. Apart from enforcement and guidance, what we have seen is the response on a legislative level. And I'm thinking here of the whole package of legislative measures that have been proposed at EU level. We have heard yesterday from the European Commission a detailed presentation about this text with a very clear goal, which was also stated yesterday by the European Commission, to really address some specific risks that we have seen with this scandal, because the texts really talk about addressing transparency, in particular as part of democratic processes, manipulation, disinformation, and this had been stated, so this is why I'm repeating it yesterday by the European Commission, that these different texts are really targeted at the activities of the online intermediaries, of the online platforms. So I think that this is also a notable response to create a safer digital space in the EU. I will not enter into the details of all of these texts because we have limited time here, but I will still take two examples to illustrate my point here. First, the Digital Services Act. So this is a text which already came into force at the end of last year. And it's interesting to note that this text contains really specific requirements addressed to online actors regarding advertising and online advertising and transparency, including very detailed information that they will have to give on who pays for showing an ad, who is the beneficiary of it, what are the parameters used to target a user, and how a user can possibly change these parameters. So really we are in the area of profiling, and we even have a prohibition to profile users using sensitive personal data, among which of course political opinions according to its meaning under the GDPR. And it's also interesting to know that in the DSA we have those specific requirements for very large online platforms, among which we also know that there is Facebook, there is YouTube, there is Twitter, and they have this requirement to conduct assessments of systemic risks that may arise regarding the use of their platforms. The DSA really specifically mentions some of the risks that should be addressed in this context. It's dissemination of illegal content, electoral processes and public security, manipulation, negative effects on privacy and data protection. So we are really in the fields that have been raised by the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Another example that I wanted to take, but which is more specific to political parties and other actors, is that we have underway a proposal for a regulation on political advertising, which was published in 2021, and it will set rules on how political parties and other relevant actors, including again online platforms, will have to publish and can carry out this advertising activities with enhanced transparency. So to sum up and conclude, I would say that things have evolved. They are in the process of changing, so we are really going towards a new legal framework and a new legal environment for addressing the specific risks highlighted by this scandal. Of course, I'm personally quite realistic because we have to see how all of this will come into play. First, how the concerned actors will embrace the whole of this framework and how they will implement it. But I also think that this will also very much depend on the regulators and on the data protection authorities and how they will react in case, there are instances of non-compliance.
Just picking up on that point about how the political actors will react, it's very interesting, and Canada is not alone in this. In Canada generally, and in British Columbia, where I'm from, our political parties are at war with one another. But on this issue, they are of one mind. This is an area that they do not want to see regulated. That, I think, has certainly been the case federally in Canada. It turns out, as the commissioner in British Columbia, I'm actually the only commissioner in Canada that has the authority to investigate how political parties collect and use information about voters. And following on, to me, that was one of the legacies of the work that Carole and Chris had done. I took that up as commissioner when I became so in 2018 and looked at a lot of pushback from the political parties across the board about looking at how they collected information, how they used it, and a deep sense of, well, as a regulator, I really don't understand the importance of political parties being able to communicate fully and frankly with the voters. And my argument to them was, what we want to do is set up a situation where the voters trust in the way you're collecting information, how you're using it, so that they will feel absolutely comfortable having those conversations and frank conversations with their candidates at the doorstep. And this all works to building that trust. And thinking of the legacy, Carole, when you think about having been now gone through all kinds of issues now, both litigation and the amazingly detailed work you've done, what do you see as the biggest legacy from that work and what happened 5 years ago and thinking about now?
I mean, I guess it's like Chris said, is that there's a generalized awareness now, isn't there? And I think the impact on the platforms was actually profound. That I think until really up until that point, the kind of the impression of the nice guys in hoodies in Silicon Valley who were like there to connect the world together was sort of blown out of the water, and we understood the power of those tech companies in a different frame. I mean, it was interesting hearing Nana talk about the ways that different regulation is coming together to address certain aspects. I mean, what I personally worry about is that, we are 7 years on now from the sort of 2016, which was really, there was a series of elections took place online with massive unknowns, manipulation, interference, whatever you want to talk about. And it took us years really to unpick just even the basics of what happened there. As you say, there is sort of, there's been a lot of talk about regulation. We are moving towards, there's 70 elections taking place globally over the next 18 months, culminating in another pivotal US election. And at the same time, this sort of incredibly, perhaps the most disruptive technology the world has ever seen has been unleashed in the form of ChatGPT and similar. And, the ability to create mis and disinformation at scale, at zero cost, is, I find terrifying. And that we certainly don't have the structures in place to even track that, let alone regulate or legislate against it. So I really feel that we are in for a really bumpy ride, and I think we haven't yet got to the point. It took, as I said, it was the whole point is it sort of took us 2 years after those elections in 2016 to try and explain to the world something of like what this murky underworld invisible underworld they couldn't see was. My fear is that this same invisibility is happening now, and people don't understand the ways that this sort of interference and manipulation is going to be unleashed upon this series of elections. And maybe we will figure out what's going on, but maybe it'll be too late.
So I'm going to ask the same question to Chris, as the person who was involved in getting the sort of the firestorm, as it were, that came upon us just over 5 years ago. And where do you see us now, and the legacy connected with?
Yeah. So I'm just looking at the screen with all these different sanctions and fines. So I was involved with the FTC fine, which was the $5 billion one, and the SEC one, $100 million. And at the time, and I think still is, that FTC sanction was the largest financial sanction of a publicly traded tech company in history. And what you don't have on screen is the share value of Facebook, because after that historic fine, the share value of Facebook increased. Because if this is as bad as it gets, and the worst that happens is you have to pay, granted, a large fine, but it's just a monetary sanction, that doesn't fundamentally change how these systems are being built, designed, and how they're operating. It's all fine and dandy to talk about transparency. The problem with transparency is that's after the fact, right? If you're calling for transparency of these platforms, the damage is already done by the time you identify it. And it's also placing the onus on civic society to do the due diligence work that, frankly, these companies should be doing themselves. So I think one of the the frustrations that I have with a lot of the discourse right now around what to do about these issues is we aren't really pushing back to these platforms and saying, you need to start to figure out how to design your systems better and design them differently to prevent problems, rather than talking about sanctions or transparency, all of these things that are after the fact so they don't prevent harm from happening. And sometimes that harm can be monumental. If you look at what happened in Myanmar, where the United Nations, as they identified, Facebook played a contributing factor to crimes against humanity with the mass murders that happened there. There are real world harms that can happen, and we really do need to start thinking about how do we require these companies to change how they make their products in the first place. When you look at regulatory design in other sectors, the harm prevention principle is paramount. And that's something that I really do see, people talk about it, but I really do see missing in a lot of the public discourse around data protection, AI, and all the things that come with that. Why are we not requiring engineers inside of these companies to do more due diligence work and to show that they've done that due diligence work prior to releasing their product? One of the things that I think is ridiculous is that there are more regulations for kitchen appliances, like a toaster oven in your kitchen, and more hurdles that you have to jump through if you want to make a kitchen appliance before releasing it into the public than a social media platform that touches billions of people. And so I think, really starting to talk about harm prevention and design is something that really needs to happen at a regulatory level.
One of the last things that I was involved in doing at the ICO when I was working with the team helping lead this Cambridge Analytica Facebook investigation is we did, and Steve Wood will remember this along with others, organizing, some of you may remember, a raid on Cambridge Analytica's office. And friends, Chris interrupted me saying the jackets, and I tell you, I had so many calls from people around the world, friends of mine, saying, I don't know what you guys are doing, but I love those jackets. They look like something out of a CSI movie or something, like FBI, except said ICO on the back. And as James Dipple Johnson at the time told me, well, there's a reason for that. It's because, obviously you're gathering evidence. You don't know who's who in the building, and so you want to be able to make sure you know your own folks and all of that. But I mentioned guilt at the end earlier, and the guilt I was feeling because in February, 2018, I accepted the job as commissioner in British Columbia and had to inform the then Commissioner Liz Denham that I was leaving town before the investigation report was completed. And so I did feel somewhat guilty about that. A very able team carried on. And I think Stephen Bonner is going to add an epilogue to this story and kind of where the ICO was at and how things concluded and went from there. Stephen.
Well, I can officially forgive you for needing to move on. We had 39 other investigators involved, so we were able to continue and work through the sort of 71 witnesses, the 700 terabytes, that's 52 billion pages of information we had to work through. But I think it's fascinating. We've heard about the sort of what are the lasting consequences, what are the cultural changes in med. And you touched on the jackets. One of those sits in the Science Museum now as part of a enduring exhibit about this kind of disinformation in the digital world. And although we're in Cambridge, it obviously has some great historians. I respect that. Fallout Boy, the greatest historians, have recently reissued a remake of We Didn't Start the Fire, and Cambridge Analytica gets a line within that summary of the last 40 years of history. So we definitely had real impact. Within the ICO, we've doubled in size since this was the largest investigation we've had. We've doubled in size because of the need to get in front of this kind of work, and absolutely, as Chris highlights, engaging through our enterprise work with adapting these things before they come to market. The other thing we've done is focus very much on harm. The ad tech ecosystem, the use of this online profiling is so amorphous and large. What we've decided to do is focus in a few areas where there is real harm occurring now, or we have the concerns there may be real harm. So we've started work, coming to the conclusion of some work around gambling and the use of marketing data. Is that exacerbating problem gambling? As one area. We're launching some work around fertility and period tracking apps, that very sensitive information collected about people, how that's being used, and we're continuing to audit some of the data management platforms within the ecosystem, the middle areas here. together. And this work will continue to focus on areas where we see these areas of maximum harm, while also working out what are the bigger issues and the wider changes we need to see to make sure that this whole ecosystem operates effectively and within the law. But it's something we're all going to need to work together on to make sure we can continue this kind of impact. But this was absolutely a complete change for the ICO. Came at the change of laws at the time, so at the moment, as touched on, the maximum fine was $500,000. Obviously, we're now up to our 4% potentially of global turnover, and obviously we have new laws coming through now. We're even in the next cycle of that, refreshing that forward with the hope of giving us additional powers around some of the issues we ran into with this investigation to make sure we're able to have the impact we need. So I think it's been a truly transformational moment for our profession, for the regulator, and I think we all still have a responsibility to work together to take that forward to make sure we don't see this kind of thing happening again.